Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. My grandson pushed me down the stairs. They laughed and said I was being dramatic. 2 weeks later, I made sure they regretted it. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. This is a story about finding strength at your weakest moment and taking back your power when the people who should love you most choose betrayal instead. The porcelain vase shattered across my hardwood floor, its delicate blue and white pieces scattering like confetti. For 5 generations, the women of the Dawson family had treasured that vase. Now it lay broken at the feet of my 10-year-old grandson, Ethan, his face twisted into the unsettling half-smile I had come to fear. He muttered a flat apology that didn't sound like one, his eyes daring me to react. My son Andrew barely looked up from his phone, dismissing it as nothing more than a vase. To him, it was only an object. To me, it was a piece of our history. My grandmother had carried it across an ocean, and my mother had protected it through the Depression rather than sell it. Later at dinner, I tried to speak calmly, though my voice shook more than I wanted. I said Ethan needed firmer boundaries because his behavior wasn't normal. Olivia, my daughter-in-law, slowly set down her wine glass and sighed as though she had heard it all before. She brushed it off, insisting boys would simply be boys. When I mentioned that he had been hurting neighborhood animals, and that Mrs. Caldwell had seen him throwing rocks at her cat, Olivia snapped back sharply, calling the woman unreliable and accusing me of criticizing her parenting. Andrew tried to smooth things over as usual, suggesting we just enjoy dinner and avoid conflict. That evening, I carried a tea tray upstairs, my arthritis making each step deliberate and painful. My once elegant Victorian home in suburban Boston had changed since Andrew and his family moved in after Charles died 5 years earlier. What had been comfort now felt like a battleground. As I reached the top landing, Ethan stepped out from the shadows. In a low voice, he whispered that nobody believed me anyway. His face was lit by the dim hallway light, and there was something cold and calculating in his eyes that felt far too old for a child. Before I could react, I felt a hard push against my back, deliberate, strong, undeniable. The tray flew from my hands as I fell backward, powerless against gravity. Each stair edge struck my body on the way down. Pain shot through me when my wrist cracked, sharp and electric. Andrew's voice shouted from somewhere below as he rushed toward me. Through tears and agony, I managed to gasp that Ethan had pushed me on purpose. Andrew and Olivia exchanged looks, but instead of concern, I saw irritation. Olivia rolled her eyes and sighed, saying I was being dramatic, and that Ethan claimed I had simply tripped. Accidents, she said, happened at my age. From the corner of my vision, I saw Ethan peeking around the hallway wall, that same disturbing half-smile still on his lips. I insisted that I knew what had happened, cradling my broken wrist. Andrew helped me up quickly, but not gently, and suggested maybe it was time to consider other living arrangements, somewhere with professional care. He said I had been confused lately, imagining things. During the drive to the hospital, a colder pain settled into me than anything in my fractured wrist. My family wasn't just refusing to believe me. They were quietly building a story where I was the confused old woman, an obstacle standing between them and what they saw as their inheritance. The cast around my wrist felt like a shackle, reminding me of how powerless I seemed. 2 weeks after the fall, as they insisted on calling it an accident, I began noticing small things in my room. My jewelry box slightly open, family photographs rearranged. The worn leather journal where I'd been writing my memoirs moved from my desk to a shelf. I wasn't losing my mind. They were making me doubt myself on purpose. Andrew stood in my doorway one afternoon and asked if I needed anything, his concern thinly covering impatience. I lied and said I was fine. After he left, I spotted an assisted living brochure peeking from beneath the newspaper. It was subtle, but intentional. That afternoon, I called Clara, my oldest friend from the neighborhood. At 75, she embraced technology with a level of enthusiasm I had always found funny, but now I desperately needed it. I whispered into the phone that they were trying to make me seem senile. She arrived the next day carrying what looked like ordinary decorations, a vintage clock, a bookend, and a small picture frame. Each one contained a hidden camera. She said her nephew worked in security and had helped her set them up. That night, we placed the cameras carefully around my bedroom and the shared areas. My hands trembled as we worked, not because of age, but because I feared what I was about to uncover. The next morning, watching the footage on the secure tablet Clara had prepared, I saw Ethan slip quietly into my room just after dawn. He moved with practiced confidence, going straight to my jewelry box. His small fingers lifted my sapphire earrings, the last Christmas gift Charles had given me before cancer took him. But that wasn't the worst part. The real shock came hours later. The footage showed Olivia standing in the kitchen, examining my earrings closely before nodding with approval and slipping them into her pocket. She praised Ethan for noticing them, telling him they were worth at least $1,000. My breath caught in my chest as I watched. Over the next week, the cameras revealed something far worse than I had imagined. A deliberate, organized pattern. Ethan regularly entered my room, taking items that were both valuable and deeply sentimental. Andrew was captured spilling coffee across my manuscript. 40 years of research on women poets of the Victorian era, brushing it off as an accident. Olivia moved my medications, then insisted I had misplaced them myself when I panicked over not being able to find them. The breaking point came during a Sunday brunch when their friends were visiting. Ethan had brought home his classroom's pet hamster for the weekend. In my bathroom, the camera recorded him holding the terrified animal underwater. His expression wasn't angry or cruel. It was curious, almost fascinated, as if he were conducting an experiment. When the hamster stopped moving, Olivia calmly helped him get rid of it. She said they would simply tell Mrs. Whitaker the animal had escaped, because these things happened. That same night, I overheard them talking through my partially open bedroom door. Olivia whispered that the house would sell for at least $1.2 million in the current market. Andrew added that there were still savings and investments, plus Ethan's college fund, now worth almost $350,000. Olivia replied that I wouldn't need any of it once I was in a nursing home. I closed my eyes, and instead of fear, a strange calm settled over me. In that moment, Catherine Dawson, the widow, the professor emerita, the mother and grandmother I had been, felt as if she disappeared, replaced by someone new, someone who had nothing left to lose. A few days later, Dr. Ramsey examined my healing wrist and asked if the pain was still bothering me. I told her the physical pain was manageable, though something in my voice made her pause. She was young for an orthopedist, perhaps 40, with sharp, observant eyes. She asked carefully whether everything was all right at home. For a moment, I considered telling her everything, but without proof it would be my word against theirs. A battle I had already lost once. I told her I was fine. As I gathered my purse, she handed me a business card and said it belonged to Audrey Hayes, a social worker who specialized in elder rights. I started to refuse, but she interrupted gently and told me to take it anyway, because sometimes talking helped. I slipped the card into my pocket, where it felt heavy and impossible to ignore. 3 days later, after Olivia casually suggested I sign power of attorney over to Andrew, I found myself sitting in Audrey's office. The room was warm and welcoming, filled with plants and soft chairs. She explained that elder abuse could take many forms, and that financial exploitation was often more common than physical harm. I protested weakly that I wasn't being abused. Audrey smiled kindly, then asked a simple question. If that were true, why was I there? Something inside me broke open, and the entire story came rushing out. Ethan's cruelty, Olivia's manipulation, Andrew's betrayal, the cameras, and the college fund they were already planning to claim. By the end, I told her I had lost everything. My dignity, my family, my home. Before she could respond, a voice came from the doorway saying I hadn't lost everything yet. A tall, silver-haired woman stood there with perfect posture and a confidence that reminded me of my younger self. Audrey introduced her as Janet Harper, the leader of their support group. Janet sat beside me and took my shaking hands in hers. She told me that 2 years earlier, her own son and daughter-in-law had tried to place her in memory care because she refused to sell her beach house to fund their failing business. When I asked what she had done, Her smile sharpened as she said she reminded them that age was not a disease, and that being underestimated was only temporary. That afternoon, I attended my first support group. The stories I heard stunned me. Educated, successful people whose independence had been quietly stripped away by their own families. Janet later introduced me to Edward Langley, a silver-haired attorney who specialized in elder law. During our consultation, he explained that cases like mine were sadly common, but that my situation included several unusual details that could work in our favor, especially the college fund. When Edward asked about the origins of the college fund, I explained that Benjamin, my first husband and Andrew's father, had created it before his early death when Andrew was 14. Later, Charles, my second husband, continued adding to it. Over the years it had grown to nearly $350,000, and I remained the sole trustee. Edward leaned forward thoughtfully. He explained that what they didn't realize was that, while the money was legally intended for educational purposes, I had broad authority as trustee to define exactly what those purposes could include. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me. Not quite hope, but something close to it, a dangerous sense of possibility. Edward continued, making careful notes in his leather-bound portfolio. He said they were building a narrative that I was mentally declining, and I confirmed it, sliding the assisted living brochures across his desk. Olivia kept placing them where I would see them, then pretending otherwise when I brought it up. We sat in Edward's oak-paneled office, surrounded by shelves of law books and the quiet confidence of a practice built over generations. With Janet's encouragement, I had expanded my documentation. A detailed journal of daily incidents, video footage backed up on external drives, and photographs of the items Ethan had stolen. Edward nodded with approval and said we were ready for Phase 2, what he called strategic compliance. The plan was simple but clever. I would appear to decline exactly as they expected. I would seem a little more forgetful, slightly more dependent, occasionally confused about names or dates. Janet had explained during our regular coffee meetings that people showed their true selves when they believed they were winning. We just needed to give them that confidence. I started immediately. At breakfast, I pretended to forget what day it was. When Olivia mentioned Ethan's upcoming school event, I acted briefly confused. Later that night, I overheard Andrew telling her that I was getting worse and suggesting they move faster with their plans. Their timeline, I thought quietly. My opportunity. The next morning, I met Victor Hayes, my financial advisor of 20 years at the bank. He informed me that someone had tried to access my accounts using my social security number, while claiming to have power of attorney. The words tasted like ash when I admitted it was likely my son. Victor said they had denied access, of course. Following Edward's instructions, I began restructuring my assets. Nothing dramatic enough to alarm anyone, just careful adjustments designed to protect what was mine. At home, I continued playing the role they expected. When Olivia suggested I sign routine paperwork, I smiled vaguely and said I would look at it later. When Andrew brought up selling some of my antiques to simplify my life, I acted as though I was considering it. After one conversation, Andrew told me I was making things too easy. I answered quietly that I was simply tired of fighting, and that he knew best. I saw a brief flash of guilt cross his face before it vanished, replaced by the cold certainty of someone convincing himself he was doing the right thing. That night, Ethan crossed another line. When I reached for my heart medication, the bottle was empty. He appeared in my doorway, holding the pills in his hand and dangling them teasingly. He said old people took too many drugs anyway, repeating something his mother had clearly said. I pleaded with him to give them back, but he told me to ask again as if I were begging, his eyes bright with anticipation. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. This was no longer just about money or property. They were dismantling me piece by piece. My grandson used deliberate cruelty, my daughter-in-law relied on careful manipulation, and my son, my own son, wielded the most devastating weapon of all, indifference. Later, alone in my room, I studied an old photograph from my teaching days. In it stood a confident woman with straight posture and steady eyes, commanding a lecture hall without ever raising her voice. I took a long breath, reached for my phone, and called the emergency number Janet had given me. I told her it was time because things had escalated. She answered calmly, saying they were ready, and asked whether I was. The next morning, during breakfast, Ethan asked when I was going to die. He said it with the same casual tone a child might use to ask for more orange juice. And the entire kitchen fell silent. I placed my teacup down carefully, noticing even Andrew looked briefly uncomfortable. He told Ethan weakly that the question was inappropriate, but there was no real conviction behind it. Olivia only smirked and said children were naturally curious about life and death. I smiled at Ethan, following the strategy Edward and Janet had taught me. I told him I didn't know and gently asked why he wanted to know. He replied that his father said they couldn't turn the house into a gaming room until I was gone, and that it was taking too long. Andrew's face shifted rapidly from shock to anger at being exposed, then to forced laughter. He claimed children misunderstood things, though he didn't deny the statement. That afternoon, I moved into the next stage of our plan. Over the past week, Clara and I had quietly removed my most precious belongings, family photographs, journals, and the jewelry still untouched by Ethan, and stored them safely at Janet's house. Now I needed a trigger. While the family was out, I placed a fabricated bank statement on my desk, one that showed a large withdrawal to an unknown account. Then I left for what I said was a therapy appointment, though in reality I met with Edward and his financial team. Edward confirmed everything was ready. He slid the documents toward me and explained that the Second Chances Foundation had officially been established as a restricted educational fund. All that remained was my signature. I stared at the paperwork that would permanently transfer Ethan's entire college fund, $350,000, into a charitable organization that supported bullying victims and older adults pursuing continued education. I asked if the decision was irreversible. Edward confirmed it was completely irrevocable. My hand trembled slightly as I signed, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what it meant. This was more than a financial decision. It felt like a declaration of independence. When I returned home, the fake bank statement had disappeared from my desk exactly as we expected. That night, I listened from my bed as Andrew and Olivia argued in their room. Olivia demanded to know how I could have withdrawn so much money without them knowing. Andrew said the bank wouldn't give him information because he wasn't authorized. She pushed him to use the dementia narrative, suggesting they get medical evaluations to gain control. They insisted the money was for Ethan's future, for their future. Lying there, listening to them plot, I felt an unexpected calm. They had shown me clearly who they were. Now it was my turn to show them who I had become. The following morning at breakfast, Olivia approached me with manufactured concern, saying Andrew had noticed unusual activity in my accounts, and that they were worried someone might be taking advantage of me. I blinked, playing the role of confusion they expected. I said I didn't remember any withdrawals. Andrew quickly stepped in, suggesting he should start handling my finances for my own safety. I frowned as if trying to recall something, then said slowly that I had moved some money. The education fund meant for Ethan's college. The atmosphere in the room instantly changed. Olivia set her cup down sharply and asked what I had done with it, her polite tone disappearing. I simply told them I had donated it to a wonderful educational foundation that helped victims of bullying and seniors continuing their education, adding that I thought it was a lovely cause. With the fund now permanently transferred to the Second Chances Foundation, I began quietly advancing the next phase of my plan. I continued removing the remaining personal items from the house, documents and keepsakes Ethan had not yet taken, and moved them to Janet's for safekeeping. While doing so, I discovered something deeply unsettling hidden among old papers. Letters Andrew had written to Charles years earlier, accusing me of being controlling and unsupportive, a complete distortion of everything I had sacrificed for him after his father died. I had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, yet those letters painted a different story. Even more troubling were medical records showing that Ethan had been diagnosed with conduct disorder, a serious condition involving persistent antisocial behavior. The files showed doctors had recommended intensive therapy, but Olivia had refused treatment because she feared the stigma. The surveillance footage continued to gather evidence, including one incident where Ethan deliberately smashed several family photographs, while Olivia simply watched and sighed, saying that kids would just be kids. Before hiding the damage, I continued my performance of cognitive decline, pretending to forget names and seeming confused about dates. The strategy worked exactly as planned. Andrew and Olivia relaxed, convinced I was no longer a threat to anything they wanted. During this time, I met privately with Audrey, who carefully documented the neglect and emotional abuse I was experiencing. Together, we assembled a detailed dossier showing exactly how I was being treated. At one meeting, I admitted my doubts. I asked what if I was wrong, what if they did care about me in their own way. Audrey gently reviewed the evidence with me and reminded me that love is shown through actions, not words. She said I deserved dignity, and hearing that gave me strength. With her support, I started reconnecting with colleagues from my teaching years. Many were shocked to learn the truth, since Andrew had told people I had become reclusive by choice. Professor Henry Mercer, now leading a creative writing program, reacted with particular outrage and immediately offered his help. As my support network grew stronger, Olivia became more aggressive about pushing property transfer documents toward me. When I asked to consult an attorney first, she lost her temper, demanding to know why I was complicating things and questioning whether I trusted my own son. Audrey happened to be present, though Olivia believed she was simply another elderly friend. With a witness there, I replied calmly that trust went both ways and that road had been closed for quite some time. The shock on Olivia's face told me it was time for the next stage. 2 months after the incident on the stairs, I placed a modified bank statement on my desk suggesting that I had moved a large sum of money into a personal account. As expected, Olivia found it while tidying my room. That night I overheard her arguing intensely with Andrew. She pushed him to confront me immediately, while he worried about how it might interfere with their plans to move me into a nursing home. The next morning at breakfast, Andrew casually brought it up, asking if I wanted help managing my finances since he had noticed some recent transactions. I acted confused, asking what transactions he meant, and saying I didn't remember anything. Over the following days, I watched their growing panic as they made frantic calls, clearly trying to track the money. Their behavior confirmed my suspicions. They had been monitoring my accounts without permission. Eventually, during a tense dinner, Olivia snapped and demanded to know what had happened to Ethan's college fund, saying the bank told her it had been emptied. I looked at them with practiced confusion and said that I had transferred it because I worried something might happen to me and wanted the money used properly. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to break. Andrew went pale while Olivia's expression twisted with barely controlled anger. She demanded to know where the money had gone, shouting that it was meant for Ethan's education. I calmly told her that it still was for education, just not exclusively his. The funds had been transferred to the Second Chances Foundation to support students in need, particularly bullying victims and seniors continuing their education. Their reactions were immediate. Olivia erupted with accusations. Andrew shifted between anger and attempts at emotional manipulation. Ethan, caught in the middle, finally showed exactly who he was, screaming that I had ruined everything and calling me cruel names, insisting the money belonged to him. I stood, looked at each of them, and said quietly that it had never been his money. It had been a conditional gift and an opportunity lost through his own actions. Then I told them I had a bag to pack. I left them sitting there in shock and returned to my room, where a small suitcase had already been prepared. The first phase of my plan was complete. The next morning, I was gone. My room remained mostly untouched, except for a few personal items, and a short note that said I needed time to think, and that they should not try to contact me. At first, Andrew and Olivia weren't worried. They assumed I would return soon, apologetic and vulnerable. In fact, they saw my absence as a chance to move forward with selling the house. But when several days became a week, concern finally appeared, not for me, but for what my absence meant for their financial plans. Andrew attempted to access my bank accounts and discovered the passwords had been changed, along with a notice that any unauthorized access attempts would be reported immediately to authorities. Meanwhile, I was comfortably settled in an apartment Janet had arranged a few towns away. From there, I quietly monitored events through trusted neighbors and the surveillance system Clara helped maintain. The cameras captured everything. Olivia and Andrew desperately searching my office for financial documents, Ethan inviting friends for destructive gatherings, and multiple visits from real estate agents who couldn't proceed with a sale without my signature. 2 weeks after I left, I initiated the next step. Edward sent a formal letter informing Andrew and Olivia that they were violating the terms of our verbal housing agreement and had 60 days to vacate the property. The letter also stated that evidence of elder abuse and attempted financial fraud existed and would be given to authorities if they failed to comply. The reaction was immediate chaos. The cameras showed Olivia raging, breaking things, and screaming accusations while Andrew looked increasingly defeated, finally realizing how serious the situation had become. Quietly, my story began spreading through the community. Former colleagues from the literature department, led by Professor Mercer, shared what had happened within influential circles, and slowly the narrative started to shift in my favor. Neighbors who had quietly watched years of disrespect toward me finally began speaking openly about what they had seen, expressing anger on my behalf. Feeling cornered, Andrew reported me as a potentially confused missing elderly person, hoping authorities would locate me and return me to the care of his concerned family. The plan backfired when Detective Laura Bennett received an envelope personally delivered by Edward. Inside was surveillance footage documenting the abuse I had endured, including the incident on the stairs, along with detailed financial and medical records proving my competence and showing the attempts to manipulate me. After reviewing everything and conducting a careful investigation, Detective Bennett located me, not to force me home, but simply to confirm I was safe and to offer further support if I needed it. 3 weeks after I disappeared, I sent out 3 important letters at the same time. One went to Andrew and Olivia, another to Ethan's school, and the third to Andrew's company. The letter to my family was a legal ultimatum prepared by Edward. It clearly outlined their choices: vacate my home within the established deadline or face formal eviction proceedings that could include criminal charges related to elder abuse and attempted fraud. The letter to Ethan's school included selected documentation of his behavior and evidence that his parents had refused recommended psychological treatment. I requested a professional evaluation for the safety of both Ethan and his classmates, including evidence of the hamster incident and other troubling behavior. The third letter, sent to the ethics department at Andrew's company, discreetly raised concerns about his use of my academic work, personal intellectual property he had apparently incorporated into a marketing campaign without proper attribution. The consequences came quickly. Within days, Andrew was called into a disciplinary meeting at work. Ethan's school required a full psychological evaluation as a condition for continued enrollment. At the same time, Edward officially began legal proceedings to reclaim my property. Olivia, realizing how serious the situation had become, shifted tactics. Through mutual acquaintances, she arranged a meeting, presenting herself as someone seeking peace. During a tense lunch in a public restaurant, she moved between emotional appeals and subtle threats, arguing that destroying the family would not restore my dignity, and warning that people might judge me for abandoning my own grandson. I stayed calm and told her gently that I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply stopped rebuilding what she kept tearing down. I added that she might want to think about her own reputation before questioning mine. As we prepared to leave, she made one final attempt, offering to return everything Ethan had stolen and promising to get him help if I would withdraw the eviction and possible legal charges. I paused, genuinely worried about Ethan despite everything. But I told her that promises required trust, and some things once broken could not be repaired. Meanwhile, Andrew began reaching out more sincerely, facing professional consequences and finally grasping the seriousness of what had happened. He wrote me a long letter admitting some mistakes, though he still blamed stress and Olivia's influence for much of it. My reply was brief but firm. I told him that growing up wasn't optional. It happened when people faced the consequences of their choices, not when they avoided them. As the eviction deadline drew closer, the family began to unravel. Andrew and Olivia fought openly, their arguments loud enough for neighbors to hear. Ethan, left largely unsupervised and sensing the tension, became even more destructive, eventually causing a serious incident at school that led to a temporary suspension. Watching from a safe distance with the support of Janet and others, I struggled with my own doubts. I questioned whether my pursuit of justice had begun to drift toward revenge, and wondered about the emotional cost for everyone involved, including myself. After 3 months filled with legal procedures, hearings, and failed attempts by Andrew and Olivia to contest the case, the eviction was finally carried out. They moved into a much smaller apartment across town. The public embarrassment hit hard, particularly Olivia, whose real estate business suffered once the story spread through local social circles. Andrew, now on probation at work and dealing with a collapsing marriage, began therapy and slowly started confronting his own patterns. Not the failures he had long blamed on me, but his difficulty taking responsibility and setting healthy boundaries. Ethan's mandatory psychological evaluation confirmed advanced conduct disorder requiring immediate treatment. Olivia reluctantly agreed to intensive therapy for him. Though she continued publicly blaming me for the trauma she claimed I had caused. When I finally returned to my house, walking through the quiet rooms filled me with conflicting emotions. I had regained my autonomy and my dignity, yet the victory felt strangely hollow because it came with the loss of my relationship with my son and grandson. Troubled by the direction everything had taken, I turned to Audrey for guidance. By then, she had become more than a professional contact. She had become a trusted friend. Audrey reassured me that I hadn't destroyed my family at all. What I had done, she said, was stop allowing them to destroy me, and that difference mattered. During that time of reflection, an unexpected letter arrived from Ethan, written with the guidance of his therapist. It contained a hesitant apology for pushing me on the stairs and for stealing from me. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it felt like the first small sign that something meaningful might still rise from the ruins of our relationship. Along with the letter came several items he had taken, including my mother's pearl necklace. Holding it again reminded me that not everything had been lost forever. Encouraged by that small step, I threw myself into building the Second Chances Foundation. With Professor Mercer and several former colleagues, I created programs designed for children struggling with behavioral issues and for older adults facing family abuse. My own story, carefully anonymized, became a case study in an ethics course at the local university. When I was invited to speak as a consultant, I discovered a new purpose: teaching young professionals how to recognize signs of elder abuse and why lifelong autonomy mattered. During one lecture, I noticed Andrew standing quietly at the back of the room. He didn't approach me afterward, and I didn't acknowledge him publicly, but his presence suggested he might finally be trying to understand. Around that same time, Janet's health took a sudden turn for the worse, and she was hospitalized with a serious prognosis. I stayed with her every day, giving back the steady support she had shown me when I needed it most. Sitting beside her hospital bed, surrounded by reminders of how fragile life truly was, I started thinking differently about forgiveness. Not as something given to those who hurt me, but as something that could free me from carrying the weight forever. 6 months after the eviction, my life had found a steady rhythm again. My home, once filled with tension, had been renovated into a space that reflected my own comfort and taste. One bedroom became a writing studio where I finally returned to the manuscript Ethan had ruined. The Second Chances Foundation flourished and awarded its first 10 scholarships. Helping both troubled youth and older adults searching for reinvention brought me a sense of purpose unlike anything I had felt before. I identified deeply with both groups. When Mayor Reynolds presented me with the Maxwell Foundation Community Leadership Award, the citation praised my distinguished service and the educational opportunities created through the Second Chances Foundation. Flashbulbs popped as I accepted the Crystal Trophy, my first public recognition since the foundation had been established 9 months earlier. I couldn't miss the irony of the moment. Not long ago I had been treated as a confused old woman, and now I stood before Boston's educational community receiving honors. In the audience sat the family I had chosen: Janet, elegant in midnight blue despite her health struggles, Audrey smiling proudly, Edward and his wife nodding in approval, Clara quietly wiping away tears, and Professor Mercer giving me an encouraging thumbs up. I began my acceptance speech by saying that second chances were not only about new opportunities, but about reclaiming your own story when others tried to write your ending for you. As I spoke about empowerment and access to education, I noticed movement near the back of the hall. Andrew slipped in and stood awkwardly against the wall. Our eyes met briefly before I continued. After the ceremony, Amid congratulations and requests for photographs, he approached hesitantly and told me the speech had been wonderful. I thanked him for coming, genuinely surprised to see him there, and asked how Ethan was doing. Andrew admitted that Ethan was struggling, though intensive therapy was helping and doctors believed the situation was complicated after years of enabling. I asked about his job, and he said things were better. The ethics investigation had been resolved, he had to complete corporate responsibility training, but he still had his position. After a long pause, he admitted he had been thinking about what I said regarding trust, and that he wanted to try rebuilding it if I was willing. Before I could answer, Janet appeared beside me, protective as ever, reminding me that foundation donors were waiting. I introduced her to Andrew, and she immediately assessed him with direct honesty, asking whether he was the son who hadn't believed his mother had been pushed down the stairs. Andrew flushed but held her gaze and said he was trying to make amends for that, and many other mistakes. After she moved away, he let out a tense breath and said quietly that my friends were formidable. They protected me when I needed it most, I replied simply. Andrew hesitated, then shared unexpected news. He said he had filed for divorce from Olivia, and it had been finalized the month before. I told him I was sorry almost automatically, but he shook his head and said it was long overdue. After everything had come to light, he explained, he realized how much of his own judgment he had surrendered to her, and how badly he had betrayed me in trying to keep the peace. I asked about Ethan and how the custody arrangement was working. Andrew told me he had primary custody now. Olivia's career, he said, had always come first, and she saw Ethan every other weekend when it fit her schedule. The bitterness in his voice hinted at deeper wounds than I had recognized before. Maybe, like me, he had been manipulated in ways I hadn't fully understood. He went on to explain that the foundation had referred them to Dr. Hayes at Boston Children's, a specialist in Ethan's diagnosis. For the first time, he said, it felt like they were receiving real help instead of excuses. I told him I was sincerely glad. Then, cautiously, he asked whether I would consider meeting Ethan in a therapeutic setting with the doctor present. Dr. Hayes believed that making amends, even in a structured environment, could be important for Ethan's progress. I hesitated, torn between conflicting emotions: the grandmother who still loved a troubled child, and the woman who had been deliberately pushed down the stairs. Finally, I told him I would consider it, and asked him to have Dr. Hayes contact me directly. As Andrew turned to leave, he paused and spoke with unexpected vulnerability. He said he was proud of what I had created, the foundation and the advocacy work, and that both of my husbands would have been proud as well. Hearing the names Benjamin and Charles stirred something deep inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Dr. Hayes' office as I waited, my hands clasped tightly to hide their trembling. 3 months of preparation had led to this moment, my first supervised meeting with Ethan since the confrontation. Dr. Amelia Hayes, calm and direct, had prepared me thoroughly, explaining that Ethan had made progress but that his empathy was still developing more intellectually than emotionally. The door opened. Andrew entered first, nodding encouragingly to someone behind him. Then Ethan appeared, taller, thinner, his eyes tired. At nearly 11, he stood at that fragile edge between childhood and adolescence, where cruelty could either be redirected or become permanent. He greeted me formally as grandmother, using the title Dr. Hayes had suggested instead of the familiar grandma. I greeted him back, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. Dr. Hayes guided the session carefully. There would be no physical contact, no unscripted conversation, and no discussion of inheritance or family conflict. Only structured communication centered on accountability and boundaries. After the initial exchanges, Dr. Hayes said that Ethan had prepared something to share. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and unfolded it carefully. He explained in a mechanical tone that it was an accountability statement. My chest tightened as he began reading. He stated that he had deliberately pushed me down the stairs on February 12th because he was angry that I suggested he needed boundaries. He acknowledged that he knew it would hurt me, that he lied afterward to avoid getting into trouble, and that when my injuries were worse than expected, he felt scared but not particularly concerned about my pain. He continued, admitting to stealing my belongings, destroying my manuscript, hurting animals, and taking pleasure in causing distress. The clinical precision of his words felt more unsettling than any emotional confession could have been. He concluded by saying his actions showed a pattern of harmful behavior, and that he was working with Dr. Hayes to understand why he acted that way, and to develop healthier responses. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and placed it on the coffee table between us, watching my reaction with analytical curiosity rather than remorse. Following Dr. Hayes' guidance, I thanked him for his honesty. The session continued according to plan: structured dialogue, therapeutic guidance when needed, and careful boundaries throughout. Ethan's responses remained controlled, almost performative, rather than emotionally connected. Even so, there were brief flickers of something more genuine, moments when the script slipped and a real child seemed to show through the careful facade. As the session came to an end, Dr. Hayes asked if I had any final thoughts. I looked directly at Ethan and told him something important: that what happened between us did not have to define who he could become. He was still young, with many paths ahead of him, and the choices he made from that moment forward mattered more than the mistakes behind him. For the first time, something unscripted crossed his face. It might have been confusion, or perhaps the beginning of understanding that the woman sitting before him was no longer the powerless person he remembered. "But you're still not giving back the college money," he said flatly. Andrew tensed beside him, but Dr. Hayes raised a hand, allowing me to answer. I explained calmly that the foundation money was now helping many students, including some facing challenges similar to his. I told him that if he continued his therapy and maintained steady academic progress, he could apply for a scholarship himself when the time came. His eyes narrowed as he processed that idea. He asked if that meant he could still get money for college. I clarified that he could earn a scholarship, based on merit and need like anyone else. The difference clearly registered. For perhaps the first time, Ethan was confronting the idea of earning something rather than simply taking it or being handed it. After the session, Dr. Hayes offered her assessment. She said the meeting had been productive. Ethan's conduct disorder created serious challenges, but she was seeing gradual progress. His accountability statement, while emotionally detached, showed cognitive growth in understanding responsibility and cause and effect. I asked the question that had stayed with me since discovering the depth of his behavior: whether he would ever develop genuine empathy. Dr. Hayes answered carefully, explaining that in severe cases like his, emotional empathy might always remain limited. However, cognitive empathy, understanding others' perspectives intellectually, could be developed. With consistent therapy and firm boundaries, many people learn to act ethically even without the emotional response most others experience naturally. Later, as I stood in the university auditorium lobby, Janet adjusted the collar of my navy blazer and asked if I was nervous. 18 months had passed since the fall down the stairs, 18 months of rebuilding and reinvention. I admitted I was a little nervous. It had been decades since I had lectured. Today marked my return to academia, not as the quiet adjunct I had become after marrying Charles, but as a visiting professor leading a seminar on elder advocacy and autonomy for graduate social work students. Audrey had helped arrange it, believing my experience could offer something beyond textbooks. Janet squeezed my hand and assured me I would do wonderfully before taking her seat. As I walked to the podium and faced roughly 36 eager students, a surprising calm settled over me. I realized I was no longer the frightened woman who had been pushed down a staircase. I was Professor Catherine Dawson again, survivor, teacher, advocate. I began by explaining that dignity did not diminish with age. Yet society often treated gray hair as a sign of incompetence, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited even by those entrusted with our care. For the next hour, I shared research alongside personal insights about recognizing elder abuse, setting boundaries, and preserving autonomy. The students listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, and their engagement filled the room. When the lecture ended in applause, I noticed Andrew sitting quietly in the back row. Over the past year, he had begun therapy himself, trying to understand how he had enabled Olivia's influence and ignored warning signs in Ethan's behavior. As the room emptied, he told me the lecture had been incredible, and that seeing me turn something painful into education for others was inspiring. I thanked him for coming, genuinely touched. Our relationship was still cautious and carefully bounded, but it was slowly healing through steady effort. As we walked toward the reception area, I asked how Ethan was doing at his new school. Andrew said the structured environment was helping, and that his therapist reported real progress with impulse control. He added honestly that Ethan still struggled with emotional empathy, but was beginning to think about consequences before acting. The therapist called it progress by proxy, doing the right thing, even if the motivation wasn't fully emotional yet. I nodded, accepting the realism of that. Ethan's path would be long and complicated, but at least it had finally begun. Later that afternoon, I met with the Second Chances Foundation board to review our growing programs. What had started as one redirected college fund had expanded into corporate partnerships, matching grants, and a long-term endowment designed to continue beyond my lifetime. Professor Mercer reported strong results, noting that 12 students were receiving specialized support that semester alone. One of those students was Ethan. Aside from Mercer, no one on the board knew the connection. His application had been reviewed independently, and his scholarship was awarded based on need and therapeutic progress, not family ties. That evening, Janet hosted a small dinner to celebrate my lecture and the foundation's newest achievements. My chosen family gathered around Janet's dining table that evening: Audrey, Clara, Edward and his wife, Professor Mercer, and several new friends I had met through my advocacy work. Janet lifted her glass and offered a toast to me, saying I was proof that a third act could become the most powerful chapter of all. As laughter and conversation filled the room, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past 18 months. The journey from victim to strength had not been simple or straight. I still carried scars, both physical and emotional. Trust had become something I offered carefully and conditionally rather than freely. Yet the woman who had emerged from those experiences felt stronger than the one who had fallen. More discerning in her relationships, firmer in her boundaries, and more deliberate in her choices. Later that night, alone in my home, which finally felt fully mine again, I stood by my bedroom window and looked out at the garden I had replanted after they left. Early spring bulbs were beginning to push through the cold soil, reaching toward light and possibility. At 75, I had finally learned what had escaped me for most of my life: that validation comes from honoring your own truth rather than seeking approval from others, that family can be chosen as well as inherited, that boundaries are not selfish but necessary, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is simply say no more. I looked at my reflection and quietly said my own name, telling myself that I was exactly where I was meant to be. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the words felt completely and unquestionably true. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.